So this is lecture 5.3, Masculinity. So this lecture is effectively the second portion of our talk on feminism, and this time we'll be talking about, I guess, the masculine component of feminism, what drives feminism in the patriarchy, what is gender normativity, what is hegemonic masculinity. That is a big SAT or ACT type word that is thrown around in feminist conversations. And then we'll talk about how sexism actually harms men. So, our definitions of gender roles and masculinity have changed dramatically in recent years, and even though some progress has been made in this regard, patriarchy maintains its negative effect on people in our society. And with all difficult topics in sociology, we must understand the phenomena to be able to address it. Uh, in general, um, when we study this branch of gender normativity, we agree that scholars agree that patriarchy, the condition, the set of structures, the negative elements of our society that are sexist toward propping up men are bad. That doesn't mean that men are bad. That doesn't mean that someone can't identify as being masculine. But it means that the elements that give distinct advantages to men, that those are bad. Because, in general, in our modern society, we want everyone to be able to, you know, a level playing field, right? And we want to try to keep that level. So, uh, I have this statement here. We live in a patriarchy, emboldened in massive letters. What exactly does that mean? What exactly is a patriarchy? Hold on for a second. I have to give a few background concepts first. The first background concept is hegemony, or hegemony. It's usually pronounced hegemony. It's a really common word to be mispronounced. I might mispronounce it once or twice in this lecture, namely because it's one of those words that is a lot easier to write and type than it is to actually say and use in fluid conversation. But that reminder definition, because I'm pretty sure that we talked about it in this course already, is hegemony is the most perfect form of an identity as defined by, as defined by a given culture. So, hegemonic identities are almost always oppressive, right? So if you think of the most manliest man, that's hegemonic masculinity, right? And what is that super manly man? What does the super manly man do? Um, we have these images of certain individuals, and by feminist constructions of this, those are, while we may think they're cool, they're maybe those are oppressive figures if you dig into what makes them cool, as it were. So here's another background concept. Men are under the constant scrutiny of other men to be hegemonically masculine, right? So much like the pressures on women that we discussed in our talk on the women on femininity, women are under the pressure to be an ideal woman, an ideal mother, someone that can do it all. Men are similarly controlled by hegemonic masculinity, so that they can be the most perfect man, the strongest man, the smartest man, etc. And this push of shame, of fear, of violence is especially strong for adolescents when those identities of masculinity are really coming to the forefront. We tell them to man up or to be a man. Well, what are we telling them not to do? Are we telling them to push down their feelings? Are we telling them to do something that might get them in physically hurt? Right? Is that really what we want to be telling our young people to do? We need to consider what those messages are we're trying to convey, and what are we trying to tell people. And that is one of the big takeaways of this entire course, is what are the subtle messages that we're conveying through culture, right? Through the things that we've been taught. Let's be self-critical. Let's analyze the ways that we've always done things. Let's not feel bad about ourselves, but let's change the way we behave to try to make the world a better place. Now, homophobia is a central organizing principle in our cultural definition of masculinity. This is like one of the things that if I could have conveyed to the people in my world when I was a teenager, I completely would have done it, right? So, and this runs so deep. It runs so utterly deep to our society and what we consider to be masculine and what we consider to be masculine in a way that's dangerous, right? To be gay from a hegemonic masculinity perspective is the opposite of the hegemonically masculine, right? The opposite of the man's man, the tough guy, what women want, what men want to be, right? Thus, being gay is the opposite of what you, a man, should be. This is the message that we convey. And this is really laid out very, very well in our text. I really liked what was in the textbook for this week. Many men are driven by the fear of being perceived as gay, right? We tell this to our young people and even to adult men. Never dress this way, right? You don't want to dress like that. You don't want to dress like a sissy. Never talk this way or walk this way. Never show feelings. Never get emotions. Never use those tones of voice, right? Always be prepared to show that you are sexually interested in a woman, right? And these are the messages that we, or at least I, encountered as a young man. And break that stuff down, right? That is messed up, right? It's okay to be a man. It's okay to be a masculine man, but it's not okay to oppress people effectively. This leads us into a concept known as toxic masculinity. The definition of toxic masculinity is behaviors that men engage in to display masculinity that wind up causing either psychological or physical damage to said individuals or others. And this does not mean that all displays of masculinity are toxic. The term toxic masculinity, it's a very descriptive term. It's a very accurate term, but if it's not fully understood, people can interpret it to mean that, all men are evil, etc., that you're not allowed to portray yourself as masculine. There are moments when I'm pretty masculine. It maybe doesn't convey it in these lectures, but some displays of masculinity are toxic. So for example, here's some examples. A man who's recently had heart surgery insists on mowing his own grass, right? Because that's what men do. Men take care of their property. Men mow the grass. Men exhibit this strength. But a man who has just undergone heart surgery should in no means be mowing his own grass. What's driving him to insist that he must do that is thus toxic masculinity. A man who has undergone serious psychological trauma refuses to go to therapy. This is a tremendous issue, certainly for women as well who have served in the military. But recent military vets who refuse to get therapy for PTSD, for example, that is a really classic example of toxic masculinity, right? It is harming that man, and it's harming the people that surround him. A father is unable to tell his grown son that he loves him, right? Because, somehow that's unmasculine, or even that's gay, or whatever, right? All no-homo culture is effectively toxic masculinity. Because why would you have to make that statement if you weren't homophobic? A man, quote, compliments, heavy quotes there, a woman he does not know by yelling nice ass, or something along those lines, right? These are unwanted compliments, right? These are things that the person did not ask for, and they are inherently sexual and sexualizing the individual. That is toxic masculinity. It doesn't necessarily harm the man doing the sexual harassment, but it certainly does harm the woman. Now we're prepared to define patriarchy. All of these things I just talked about are part of patriarchy. They're symptoms of patriarchy. The definition of patriarchy are the overarching structures of sexism, heterosexism, and gender conformity that display hegemonic masculinity. And thus, studying and dismantling the patriarchy is the theme of this and the following sections of this course. This section on sexism, masculinity, femininity, this really lays the groundwork for the next couple sections of the course, where we're talking about heteronormativity, where we're talking about trans rights issues. Yeah, we live in a patriarchy, and because of that, sexism and homophobia seem as normal, or, they have seemed as normal until relatively recently. A lot of the sexism in our society and homophobia in our society are being actively challenged. So hopefully that means that we are starting to break down the patriarchy, which from a equality human rights standpoint is a good thing. Just like other forms of oppression, patriarchy is built into our society, right? So just like racism that we talked about earlier in the course, patriarchy is built into our society. It is a subtle structure to our society. It's everywhere. We all probably do sexist things and don't even think about it because of that implicit bias built into us. It should be noted, patriarchal structures hurt both women and men. And this is something that is really built into third wave feminism. Feminism is not about hating men. It's about dismantling patriarchy for the benefit of all. This is one of really my favorite images, very soundly being a third wave feminist concept. For every girl who's tired of acting weak when she's strong, I'm just going to read the whole thing. There is a boy tired of appearing strong when he feels vulnerable. For every boy who is burdened with the constant expectation of knowing everything, there's a girl tired of people not trusting her intelligence. The whole mansplaining phenomena. For every girl who is tired of being called oversensitive, there's a boy who fears to be gentle, to weep. For every boy for whom competition is the only way to prove his masculinity, there's a girl who is called unfeminine when she competes. For every girl who throws out her easy-bake oven, there's a boy who wishes to find one. For every boy struggling not to let his advertising dictate his desires, there's a girl facing the ad industry's attacks on her self-esteem. For every girl who takes a step toward her liberation, there's a boy who finds the way to freedom a little easier. There is a conversation on how patriarchy, dismantling the patriarchy, would be beneficial to both boys and girls. There are 4 ways that gender roles support the patriarchy. First, while gender roles are social constructions, they are perceived as being biological, natural, inherent. For example, women care for children, men are violent. These are statements that are commonly said in our society, or at least assumed in our society. And those are they're not biological, they're not inherent, they're not natural. The concept that those are underpinnings of patriarchy. Gender roles are based on heteronormativity, which we will discuss in coming weeks. But let's define heteronormativity as being heterosexuality seen as normal or natural, and thus anything else is viewed as being not normal, not natural, not good. Those are that is another major underpinning of patriarchy. Because patriarchy, let's remember, does not just oppress women, it does not just oppress men, it oppresses non-heterosexuals, it even oppresses heterosexuals, it oppresses everybody. Male and female gender norms are set up as opposites. Now this doesn't sound necessarily to be inherently negative, but it sets up a dichotomy, right? Men are strong, women are weak. Men are stoic, women are emotional. Men work, women stay home with children. So this sets up really strict guidelines to what people can do and what they can't do, right? And anytime a social structure sets up what people can't do, it has a strong tendency to be discriminatory. And finally, violence is used to punish those who violate gender norms. Hate crimes against homosexuals are almost inherently they do a long way to underpinning the patriarchy. We see a lot of this in high school bullying that also is disproportionately aimed at people who dare to violate gender norms. If we want to look at a historic example, witch burnings and those sort of things, those were obvious, incredibly obvious acts of violence against people who violated gender norms. Blaming rape victims as quote-unquote asking for it, or she shouldn't have been there, or she shouldn't have dressed that way or drank that much. We never say that about men. And by a woman acting out sexually and not being almost virginal, she is then punished. There's a feminist concept known as the Madonna horror complex. You can probably Google search that and find what you need there. We don't have quite time to go over it, unfortunately. So a question comes up: why do good men go along with this? Well, we're socialized to be obsessed with power and strength, and if that power is challenged, then it is challenging to masculine identity. And this is part of what makes social change so difficult: is that some men feel personally challenged when a system is challenged. In very traditional terms, generations of men were taught that your job is to protect your family, to protect children, and women do these things, children do these things. And if those structures are challenged, right, those very traditional social structures that people bought into very well, they see it as being a challenge to themselves. It's why racism continues. It's why heterosexism continues. It's why all kinds of negative social structures continue in our society. Is because effectively good people, some well-intending people, grandfathers and fathers are afraid of change. Another reason good men go along with it is that the rules of masculinity have been so rigidly constructed that any variation on it implies weakness, right? So the vast majority of men cannot live up to incredibly rigid social structures that have been built into the patriarchy, and that causes stress to those who believe the myths of the patriarchy, right? I certainly cannot be either of these, incredibly tough-looking men right here. The lumberjack, the very cool, apparently very rich man with a cigar. Now, keep in mind, neither of these guys are those guys either, right? These are actors, right? We're looking at actors. They might be homosexual men, right? Now, we wouldn't assume that these two guys are because of, the way patriarchy structures sex assumptions, right? But they might be. Yeah, and this is how we are oppressed as men. Thus, when our men are raised to believe that they should be in charge of society and their families and their workplace, and they do not have that power, they feel great frustration. So when men have been taught their whole lives that they are going to be the ones in charge, that they are going to be the protectors, then they could feel depression, they can feel anxiety, and that can cause some men to express sexist or homophobic views when it's a coping mechanism. It's not a positive coping mechanism, but it's a coping mechanism. And that can drive some men to violence, right? Now, our job is not to coddle these men. nor do I think that, given the way many men have learned masculinity, they would want to be coddled. But, and another, we must point out the errors of their ways. We must help people change if they are open to change. You, quite frankly, though, I've gotten to a point in my life and recognize that you can't change people who don't want to change. So you need to make personal decisions as far as that goes, as far as your own personal relationships. But if people are open, if they want to change, as academics, as potential activists, it's our job to have these conversations. And that's hard for me to do as well. We must also help to raise boys who do not feel the sense of oppressive entitlement to power over others, right? We must attempt to not restructure the patriarchy for future generations. This is the what do I do about this section of this portion of the course, right? How do we fix it? Well, this slide is kind of how we fix it. Okay, neat. This is really interesting stuff. It really opens the door for other things that will be coming in coming weeks. And I look forward to our conversations.